Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Widia Lariviere, a feminist and activist for Indigenous causes. She's been involved in many youth initiatives and co-founded the Quebec chapter of the Idle No More movement in 2012. Widia produces documentaries, writes, and comments about the plight of many Indigenous women. Widia, thank you so much for joining us on Face to Face.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to start with Idle No More and a little on your role and how you became involved in the movement in 2012.
It all started in 2012, December 2012, and I was actually seeing all the mobilization going on all across Canada, the marches, and I really got inspired by that, but I was wondering why there was nothing going on yet in Quebec, and I actually realized it was because of a language barrier, because most of the information from the Idle No More movement at that time was in English. So we wanted to make the information available in French for the Indigenous people in Quebec who speak French, their Indigenous language, but not that much English. So that's pretty much when I started to get involved in the Quebec branch of the Idle No More movement. We created like a Facebook page in French, a Twitter account in French, and we also wanted to show that the Indigenous people from Quebec were also involved in joining the movement. And so we started also to organize marches and events in Montreal and eventually like all across Quebec. So yeah, that's pretty much like how I started getting involved in the movement.
Was it difficult pulling people together at first, or were people already aware of what was taking place?
People were kind of already aware because they saw on the news, like maybe more from the English media, that what was going on. But at the same time, they didn't know like what was going on exactly, like because it was about complex omnibus bills, like for example C-45, C-38, and it's kind of like hard to understand all the impacts of these omnibus bills. So yeah, we had to organize not only marches but popular education events where we would explain like the issues like related to the movement. For the Indigenous peoples, but also for the non-Indigenous peoples who didn't know like exactly what was going on. And we actually, in Quebec, we organized the first march in Montreal, and eventually other Indigenous people from all across Quebec started to organize their own marches and events also all across Quebec. So it was really inspiring to see that going on.
What did you see as the vision for Idle No More, and why you wanted to be involved and get a chapter going out there?
I've always been involved for the rights of Indigenous people. It's a really important topic for me, and I just realized that Idle No More is basically a movement for the rights of Indigenous people, the right to self-determination for our lands, etc. So yeah, that's the reason why I started getting involved in the movement. So, and at the same time, because we hear a lot about official representatives and chiefs, and what was interesting about the movement is that it also gave voice to the grassroots Indigenous population, and also like there was a lot of youth involved and also a lot of women involved. Actually, women are at the forefront of the movement. Yeah.
It didn't take long for the movement to get pretty big. Why do you think it was something that inspired so many people at the time?
I think it was interesting to see such a strong solidarity among Indigenous people all across Canada. At the same time, I think it's like the first time that we see that. Maybe we see local initiatives, but it's really rare that we see all the Indigenous people getting together in solidarity all across the country. So I think that's one of the aspects that inspired people to get involved in the movement. And also, as I said, the fact that there was a lot of youth and women involved in the movement, it also created a dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So yeah, I think that's the kind of positive impacts that the movement had.
Did you think it was going to take off the way it did and grow to the size that it did?
No. The first march that we organized actually in Montreal, we thought that we were expecting, well, we thought that we would expect maybe 10 or 20 people. We made a Facebook event, and eventually we saw that people were saying that they were going to attend the march. But no, we thought that maybe like just a few people would attend the march. And then the first march in Montreal on December 21st, 2012, there was actually maybe 500 people who showed up. And for Montreal during winter at -30, that's for an Indigenous cause, that's something big. And eventually we organized marches with more than 2,000 and 3,000 people. And so I was not expecting that. It was really, really inspiring to see all the solidarity that you were getting from all the different Indigenous nations across Quebec and Canada, but also from the non-Indigenous people who were supporting the movement.
What do you think the impact was of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people coming together, in cities and places all across the country?
The impacts of?
Just the impact of, getting out that many people to come together and speak out for rights across the country.
Yeah, I think it was interesting to create that dialogue. Like I said earlier, a lot of Indigenous people at the beginning knew that something important was going on, but they didn't know exactly, they didn't understand exactly all the complexities of the omnibus bills and the issues of the movement. So it was interesting to make that information accessible with popular education, and to talk about issues like human rights, the Indigenous rights. And also, it was also interesting to create dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and it was at the same time an opportunity to talk about the issues of the movement, but also to sensitize non-Indigenous people about Indigenous issues in general, because a lot of them said that they saw on TV what was going on, but they didn't know much more about exactly about the issues of the movement.
Do you feel some of your goals were achieved from when you initially started up the chapter?
I think there was a lot of positive impacts. As I said, I think it revived the cultural and identity pride of a lot of Indigenous youth. I personally got comments from Indigenous youth who were more motivated to get involved in their communities after their involvement in the I Don't Know More movement. And also, same thing with the women. I think it gave a voice to Indigenous women who are, as we know, underrepresented on the political scene right now for different social and historical reasons related to colonizations. So, so this movement gave back a voice to women, youth, and the grassroots voice of Indigenous people. And I know that for maybe more the political level, there's people who said we didn't get to change the bills that were presented by the last Harper government. But at the same time, I met researchers who said that we still had impact on the political level, because the opposition parties started to get more and more to include more Indigenous issues in their programs. And also, I know, for example, CBC Indigenous said that they created, well, CBC said they created CBC Indigenous as part of the first anniversary of I Don't Know More. So I think the movement has really created a lot of positive impacts when we take time to think about it.
Now, the movement seems to have been rather quiet in recent years. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the movement still exists because I know there's a lot of people who ask me, is like, I don't know more is still going on? And I say yes, there's still a lot of people involved in the movement. It's just at the very beginning, maybe it gave the impression that it was a movement like more that in the streets and that the medias were getting interested more about that aspect of the movement. But actually, I Don't Know More started with popular education, with what we call teach-ins. The 4 co-founders of the movement started the movement with a teach-in in popular education, and I think that's where I Don't Know More is getting involved right now, more about with education, raising awareness with campaigns. For example, if you go on their website and on the social medias, you can see that they got involved with a campaign about the housing crisis in the communities, and we also get involved in specific moments and make call for actions at specific strategic moments. And for example, for the 1st of July, there's a call for action as part of the 150th anniversary of the Canadian Confederation. So.
And we'll talk hopefully a little bit more about that, but first we got to just throw to a quick break, and then we'll continue our conversation here on Face to Face in just a few minutes. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Widia Lariviere, an activist for Indigenous causes and a co-founder of the Quebec chapter of the Idle No More movement. And before the break, we were talking about an event that's coming up, and Idle No More is calling for a national day of action on July 1st, and when many people will be celebrating Canada's 150th birthday. Yeah. What's planned for Idle No More?
There's actually currently a call for action that's been announced on social medias. We're currently we want to translate also the information in French to reach also people in Quebec. So I think for a lot of Indigenous people, the 150th anniversary has a different meaning. It's not really a celebration, but maybe an opportunity to denounce the violations of human rights and the violations of Indigenous rights that are still going on today, and a reminder that the history of Canada was built on the genocide of Indigenous people and territorial disposition of Indigenous people. So there's a call for action for the 1st of July, and everybody is invited to host an event or to participate in an event in their city or organization. And there's actually 3 specific messages that the movement wants to share as part of that call for action. And it's a reminder actually that Indigenous people want a real nation-to-nation relationships with the Canadian governments and other provincial governments. Also a reminder to fully implement the 94 calls for action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and to fully implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And a lot of people are talking about the 150th anniversary of the Canadian Confederation, but they forget that it's also the 10th anniversary of this declaration, and that Indigenous people worked many years to develop this declaration that the Canadian government is still failing to fully implement it. So yeah, the movement is actually taking advantage and taking this opportunity to use the celebrations to make this reminder, and just also to remind how the history of colonization of the country.
Widia, what does Canada 150 mean to you?
Well, as I said, I think as an Indigenous person, it has a different meaning than other citizens. And as I said, I think Canada was actually built on the genocide of Indigenous people and the territorial dispossession of Indigenous people. So for me, it's not really it's not a celebration, and I think it's an opportunity to make these reminders about the violations of human rights and Indigenous rights, and I want to use this opportunity to make these reminders. So that's why I'm also getting involved in the call for action of the I Don't Know More movement.
You're in Winnipeg for an exhibit that you're a part of at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights to share uplifting stories for Canada 150. What's your role in that?
I was actually selected among different people who are involved in defending human rights across Canada, and I was really proud to be chosen to talk about Indigenous issues and Indigenous realities as part of that exhibition. And I think it's interesting also to put a human face, to humanize Indigenous realities. So I think that's why the exhibition wanted to share those personal stories, and that was also an opportunity for me to educate and to raise awareness about Indigenous realities and Indigenous issues.
What are you hoping people take away from your part of the exhibit? To realize that there's still a lot of violations of human rights and Indigenous rights still going on in Canada, and also the importance to get involved for this cause, and also to realize that we just need to make fundamental change to fully respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Part of this all was an event called the Human Library, aimed at discussing and confronting stereotypes and assumptions. How did that go for you?
That went well. That was interesting to meet students from here, from Winnipeg, non-Indigenous students, and to actually have a dialogue with them about Indigenous realities and Indigenous issues. I was actually surprised to see that most of them knew about residential schools, because where I live in Quebec, they don't teach about residential schools yet in their history class. So I was surprised to see that, and kind of happy to see that, and it was also really interesting to listen what kind of questions that you'd have about Indigenous realities, and also about my story. And I think it's a really interesting way to break down stereotypes and assumptions that they can have about Indigenous peoples.
You used to work with youth a lot. What were some of the things that the youth today were, do you hope, taking away from all of this?
Well, I think they wanted to know more about current issues of Indigenous peoples, because at school they mostly learn about history, but they were interested in also learning about the current realities and the current issues. And it was also important for me to share with them maybe my passion, and to show them that there's different ways to get involved for this cause, or for any cause, like human rights cause, that would be important for them, and that ordinary people like me or them can actually get involved and have positive impacts about the human rights, the respect of human rights.
Widia, we'll hold you there and then take another quick break, and we'll come back and talk about a prestigious award related to human rights that you've recently been honored with. We'll be right back with more Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Widia Lariviere, an Indigenous activist who helped create the Quebec chapter of Idle No More. And Widia, you are one of a number of people involved in the Indigenous rights movement in Canada to be honoured with a very prestigious award, the Amnesty International Ambassador of Conscience Award. Sharing the award with the likes of Cindy Blackstock and Senator Murray Sinclair, what does an honour like that mean for you?
It was really surprising, and it's a real honor to get this award. And what I was really happy about is to see that they actually want to give the award to 6 different Indigenous people from all across Canada. And it's interesting because that shows the diversity of Indigenous people in the movement, and also the diversity of the ways to get involved in the movement of respecting the rights of Indigenous people. So that's really interesting that they give it to 6 different people.
What was it like for you to have your name mentioned among some of those pretty heavy hitters here in the picture?
It's really an honor because I really admire everybody who is winning the award, and especially Cindy Blackstock. I've been following her and her involvement with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So, yeah, it's a real honor.
And a real honor for us to have you. I should mention those awards, they'll be presented at a ceremony later this month in Montreal, so congratulations to you and to Cindy and everybody else involved. Widia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this week. We will be watching to see what unfolds on July 1st as well, so thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us. This marks the final episode of Face to Face for this season. We'll be back in the fall. Thanks so much to all of our guests this year, and a huge thanks to our crew. Make sure that we make it on the air each week. But of course, we're always still looking for new guests. So if you have any suggestions over the summer, please email us at news@aptn.ca. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. We'll see you again in the fall.